What happens when a persistent man, without any higher legal education, tries to defend himself and restore justice, of which there is very little left in the world? Chris Peterson stood at the entrance of the courthouse, his breath steady but his heart pounding. He adjusted his second-hand navy suit, the fabric slightly too loose across his shoulders, and stepped inside. The heavy wooden doors creaked shut behind him, muffling the sounds of the Memphis street outside. As he walked through the dimly lit hallway, the smell of aged varnish and paper filled his nose. Today, this unassuming man with no legal degree or fancy credentials was here to fight for his late grandmother's home. A modest house that held generations of memories, now on the brink of being seized by a powerful bank. The courtroom was packed, the air alive with a muted hum of whispers and the creak of chairs as spectators shifted in their seats. Chris caught glimpses of polished shoes and tailored suits, the uniform of the bank's representatives, who lounged with smug expressions, their murmured laughter barely audible. At the front of the room, Judge Edwin Burke sat perched on his high bench, a man whose reputation for sarcasm and sharp dismissals preceded him. The lines on his face deepened as he smirked, watching Chris approach the defendant's table. "Ah," Burke said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Mr. Peterson, I presume? I hope you realize this isn't the neighborhood association meeting. You're in a court of law now." The courtroom tittered with laughter, and Chris felt a flush rise to his cheeks. But he kept his composure, setting his neatly arranged folders down on the table and meeting Burke's gaze. "I'm aware, Your Honor," Chris said, his voice steady but firm. On the other side of the room, Jeffrey Lawrence, the bank's corporate attorney, rose from his seat with the languid grace of someone who knew he'd already won. His slicked-back hair shone under the fluorescent lights, and his smirk was as sharp as the cut of his expensive suit. "Your Honor," Lawrence began, his voice dripping with feigned courtesy. "I must say I admire Mr. Peterson's determination. It takes a certain kind of boldness to walk into this courtroom without a legal team or any real understanding of the law. A self-styled knight in shining armor, fighting windmills." The spectators laughed again, the sound grating in Chris's ears. He felt their eyes on him, assessing, doubting, dismissing. He straightened his shoulders, forcing himself to breathe. Judge Burke chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, Mr. Peterson, you've heard Mr. Lawrence. Do you seriously think you can prove anything here today? Or are we wasting everyone's time?" Chris met the judge's gaze, his expression calm but resolute. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe I had a case." Burke raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Well, then," he said, waving a hand dismissively, "by all means proceed. Let's see what you've got." Chris opened the first folder on the table, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. The faint smell of old paper rose as he pulled out a stack of documents. "Your Honor, this case isn't about missed payments. It's about fraud." The courtroom quieted, the murmurs fading as the weight of his words settled over the room. Chris continued, his voice measured but firm. "My grandmother, Margaret Peterson, paid her mortgage on time every single month. I have copies of her payment receipts to prove it. What the bank has submitted to this court, claiming otherwise, is not only inaccurate, it's fabricated." Jeffrey Lawrence let out a theatrical sigh, rising to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is conjecture from a man who barely understands the difference between a court filing and a grocery list." Burke waved his hand lazily. "Overruled. Let's see where this is going." Chris took a deep breath, holding up one of the documents. "This is a copy of a receipt for a payment made on March 15th, stamped and signed by the bank. The bank claims my grandmother missed this payment, but the receipt clearly shows otherwise." He handed the document to the clerk, who brought it to Burke. The judge examined it, his smirk fading slightly as he leaned closer. "This receipt looks legitimate," Burke muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He glanced at Lawrence. "Mr. Lawrence, care to comment?" Lawrence hesitated for a fraction of a second before recovering. "Your Honor, I'd need time to verify the authenticity of this document. For all we know, it could have been doctored." Chris held up another folder. I have more receipts, Your Honor, covering months the bank claims were unpaid. And I have a letter my grandmother sent to the bank, dated 2 months before her passing, in which she pleaded for them to correct their records after she noticed discrepancies. He opened the folder, retrieving the letter written in his grandmother's shaky but determined handwriting. She wrote this letter, Chris said, his voice thickening with emotion, because she believed in the fairness of the system. She trusted that someone would do the right thing. Burke took the letter, his eyes scanning the page. The courtroom was silent now, the earlier laughter replaced by a tense anticipation. Lawrence sat stiffly, his jaw tightening as Chris's evidence began to stack up. Your Honor, Chris continued, I also have a witness prepared to testify, my grandmother's neighbor, who saw a representative from the bank visit her shortly before her passing. This representative made threats and pressured her to sign documents she didn't understand. The gallery stirred, whispers rising again as the weight of Chris's words sank in. Burke set the letter down, his expression unreadable as he looked at Chris. All right, Mr. Peterson, he said, his tone less dismissive than before. You've got my attention. Let's hear what this neighbor has to say. Chris nodded, a flicker of hope sparking within him. He knew he was far from finished, but for the first time, the tide seemed to shift, ever so slightly in his favor. Chris Peterson sat straighter in his chair, his determination unwavering despite the oppressive weight of the courtroom's skepticism. Judge Edwin Burke leaned back in his chair, his sharp eyes scanning Chris with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. The earlier chuckles from the gallery had quieted, replaced by a faint hum of tension. Even Jeffrey Lawrence, the bank's corporate attorney, now sat with his arms crossed, his smirk replaced by a tight-lipped expression. Chris stood, adjusting his suit jacket. Your Honor, I would like to call Ms. Helen Brooks to the stand. The courtroom doors opened, and Helen, a woman in her 70s with a kind but resolute demeanor, walked in. She clutched her handbag tightly, her step steady. Chris offered her a reassuring nod as she approached the witness stand. Her eyes met his briefly, offering a silent message. I'm here for Margaret, and I'm here for you. Judge Burke sighed, gesturing toward her. Ms. Brooks, state your name and relation to this case for the record. Helen spoke clearly, her voice carrying through the courtroom. My name is Helen Brooks, and I was Margaret Peterson's neighbor for over 30 years. I watched her struggle against the bank's harassment shortly before she passed. Burke raised an eyebrow, glancing at Chris. Interesting. Proceed, Mr. Peterson. Chris moved closer to the stand, his movements deliberate. He knew this was a pivotal moment, and he couldn't afford to falter. Ms. Brooks, could you please describe what you witnessed on the day in question? Helen's hands gripped the sides of the stand as she spoke. I was in my garden when I saw a man in a suit knock on Margaret's door. He carried a clipboard and looked agitated. I couldn't hear everything they said, but I saw him raise his voice and wave papers in her face. Margaret looked upset. More upset than I'd ever seen her. What did you do next? Chris asked. I walked over and asked if everything was all right, Helen said. The man turned to me and said it was none of my business, but Margaret told me later that he was threatening her. He said if she didn't sign some papers, the bank would take her house. The gallery stirred again, whispers filling the air as the weight of Helen's testimony sank in. Lawrence rose from his chair abruptly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay. Burke waved his hand lazily, his gaze fixed on Helen. Overruled. Continue. Helen straightened, her voice growing steadier. Margaret told me she didn't understand what the papers were for. She asked the man to leave, but he wouldn't. He kept pressuring her. She was scared, but she refused to sign. Chris nodded, his voice gentle but firm. Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Your testimony confirms what Margaret wrote in her letter to the bank. She knew something wasn't right, but she didn't have the resources to fight back. Lawrence scoffed loudly, standing to address the judge. Your Honor, this so-called testimony is nothing more than a desperate attempt to salvage an indefensible case. Chris turned to face Lawrence directly, his gaze steady. Desperation isn't why I'm here, Mr. Lawrence. I'm here because the evidence speaks for itself. And there's more. Burke leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. Go on, Mr. Peterson. Chris returned to the defendant's table, retrieving another folder. He held up a series of documents, his voice steady as he addressed the court. These are payment receipts covering the months the bank claims were missed. Each receipt is stamped and signed by the bank's representatives, proving Margaret made her payments on time. He handed the documents to the clerk, who distributed them to the judge and the gallery. Burke examined the receipts, his earlier smirk fading as he studied them closely. Lawrence's face darkened, his earlier arrogance giving way to visible unease. Your Honor, Chris continued, his voice rising slightly, these receipts, along with Margaret's letter and Ms. Brooks's testimony, show a clear pattern of harassment and fraud by the bank. Burke set the documents down, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Lawrence, who sat stiffly, his jaw tightening. The courtroom was silent, the earlier skepticism replaced by a growing sense of tension. Chris had managed to shift the momentum, but the fight was far from over. He returned to his seat, his hands resting lightly on his folders. He knew this was only the beginning, but he felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, the courtroom seemed to be listening. Chris Peterson adjusted his tie as he stood once more, his focus sharper than ever. The courtroom had grown quieter, the weight of his evidence slowly suffocating the earlier smugness emanating from Jeffrey Lawrence. Judge Edwin Burke tapped his fingers idly on his desk, his once sardonic smile now replaced by a more measured expression. Mr. Peterson, Burke said, leaning forward slightly, you've given us receipts and testimony. Let's not waste the court's time. What's next? Chris took a deep breath, sensing an opportunity to press further. Your Honor, I would like to reference the Truth in Lending Act. Specifically, the sections pertaining to the protection of consumers from deceptive lending practices. The mention of the federal act sent a ripple through the gallery. Lawrence's brow furrowed deeply, and he stood abruptly. Your Honor, this is absurd. A layman attempting to interpret federal legislation? Really? Burke raised a hand to silence Lawrence, his gaze narrowing as he regarded Chris. Let him speak, Mr. Lawrence. I'm curious to hear what he has to say. Chris turned to the judge, his voice calm but commanding. The Truth in Lending Act exists to ensure transparency and honesty in financial transactions. It explicitly forbids deceptive practices, such as falsifying records to justify foreclosure. The receipts I've presented, along with Ms. Brooks's testimony, suggest that the bank violated this act. Burke tilted his head, his interest unmistakable. And you believe you can prove that? Yes, Your Honor, Chris said firmly. He returned to his table and pulled out another set of papers. These documents include correspondence between the bank and my grandmother. They show a pattern of unclear explanations and deliberate errors in accounting that directly contradict the principles outlined in the Truth in Lending Act. He passed the documents to the clerk, who handed them to Burke. The judge flipped through them, his lips pressing into a thin line. Lawrence shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his confidence visibly shaken. This correspondence, Burke muttered as he scanned the pages. If these errors were intentional, it would indeed constitute a violation of federal law. Chris nodded. That's correct, Your Honor. And it's not just limited to these documents. There's more. Lawrence stood again, his voice louder this time. Your Honor, this is pure speculation. Mr. Peterson is grasping at straws, throwing accusations without understanding the complexity of these transactions. Chris turned to Lawrence, his tone unwavering. I'm not grasping at straws, Mr. Lawrence.
I'm presenting facts.
And if you truly believe these accusations are baseless, then why not address the discrepancies in the documents? Why not explain why a respected grandmother, who paid her mortgage faithfully, suddenly became a defaulter? The gallery buzzed with murmurs as Chris's question hung in the air. Lawrence opened his mouth to respond but faltered. his words catching as he glanced at Burke. Burke's gaze shifted to Lawrence, his patience wearing thin. "Well, Mr. Lawrence? Do you have an explanation?" Lawrence hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. "Your Honor, these discrepancies could be attributed to clerical errors. It happens in institutions as large as ours." "Clerical errors that conveniently lead to foreclosure?" Chris asked, his tone pointed. "And that required a bank representative to threaten an elderly woman in her own home?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Lawrence's face reddened as he struggled to respond. Chris knew he had struck a nerve, but he wasn't finished. There was still one more piece of evidence, one that could turn the case decisively in his favor. "Your Honor," Chris said, his voice steady, "I have one final piece of evidence to present. It's a document that was found among my grandmother's belongings after her passing. A document that may explain why the bank was so intent on seizing her home." Burke's eyebrows shot up. "Let's see it, Mr. Peterson." Chris reached into his folder, his heart pounding as he withdrew the paper. This was it, the document his grandmother had kept hidden, perhaps out of fear or uncertainty, but one that now held the power to expose the truth. He handed it to the clerk, who passed it to Burke. As the judge read the document, his expression darkened. The gallery stirred, the tension in the room reaching its breaking point. "What is this?" Burke demanded, his voice sharp. He looked up, his eyes locking onto Lawrence. "An internal memorandum from the bank?" Chris nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. This memorandum outlines a strategy for targeting vulnerable homeowners, like my grandmother, with predatory practices to force foreclosures and profit from their losses." The gallery erupted into gasps, and Lawrence shot to his feet, his voice desperate. "Your Honor, this document cannot be verified. It could be fabricated." Burke raised a hand, silencing Lawrence with a glare. "Sit down, Mr. Lawrence. We'll determine its authenticity." Chris stood tall, his voice unwavering. "Your Honor, I believe this memorandum, along with the receipts, testimony, and correspondence, proves that the bank acted not just negligently, but maliciously. They targeted my grandmother, falsified records, and attempted to take her home through deception." Burke leaned back in his chair, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. The courtroom buzzed with energy, the tide clearly shifting in Chris's favor. "Very well," Burke said finally. "We'll adjourn for today. I'll review this evidence thoroughly before making any rulings." Chris exhaled slowly, his chest tight with a mix of hope and determination. He had fought this battle alone, armed only with his conviction and his grandmother's trust in him. And for the first time, he felt that justice might actually be within reach. The courtroom was alive with tension, every spectator now leaning forward as the case reached its boiling point. Judge Edwin Burke held the damning internal memorandum in his hands, his expression shifting from bemusement to something bordering on anger. Chris Peterson stood firm, his heart pounding as he watched the ripple effect of his evidence unfold. Jeffrey Lawrence, the bank's corporate attorney, sat stiffly, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Mr. Lawrence," Burke said sharply, turning his attention to the shaken attorney, "this memorandum implicates your client in deliberate and unethical practices. What do you have to say for yourself?" Lawrence rose slowly, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, we would need time to investigate the origin of this document. It could have been tampered with or misrepresented." Burke cut him off, slamming his gavel down with a loud crack that echoed through the room. "Enough, Mr. Lawrence. The authenticity of this memorandum will be verified, but right now you look like someone grasping at straws. I suggest you start preparing answers instead of excuses." The gallery erupted in whispers, the energy in the room buzzing as Lawrence sat down heavily, his confident facade crumbling. Chris took a deep breath, knowing that this was the moment to press further. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "this memorandum is just the beginning. It highlights a systematic approach to exploiting homeowners like my grandmother, vulnerable people who trusted the bank to act with integrity." He turned to the gallery, his eyes sweeping over the spectators. My grandmother didn't have a legal team or the resources to fight back, but she left behind evidence, believing that someone would stand up for her. That's why I'm here. Burke leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he studied Chris. You've made your case, Mr. Peterson. It's clear you've come prepared. What's more surprising is how well you've navigated this process without legal counsel. Chris hesitated, the weight of Burke's words settling over him. I may not have a degree, Your Honor, but I have something my grandmother taught me, resilience. And I've spent every spare moment over the past months learning everything I could about the laws that protect homeowners like her. Burke nodded slowly, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine respect. The gallery stirred again, murmurs of admiration filling the room as they began to see Chris in a different light. Lawrence, sensing his advantage slipping away, rose once more. Your Honor, I must object to this emotional appeal. We're here to discuss facts, not sentiments. Burke shot him a glare that silenced any further protests. Sit down, Mr. Lawrence. I think we've heard enough of your attempts to deflect. Chris stepped back, his heart steady as he returned to his seat. The evidence was overwhelming, and the truth was undeniable. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he felt the weight lifting from his shoulders. The battle wasn't over yet, but the momentum had shifted decisively in his favor. The gallery, once filled with skeptical whispers and dismissive laughter, now buzzed with admiration and anticipation. Chris had stood alone against a powerful institution, armed only with his grandmother's trust and his relentless pursuit of justice. And now, he was closer than ever to ensuring that her legacy would not be tarnished by deception. Judge Edwin Burke surveyed the courtroom, the weight of Chris Peterson's evidence pressing heavily on his shoulders. The internal memorandum, payment receipts, testimonial evidence. It all painted a damning picture of the bank's conduct. The gallery was silent now, a palpable energy pulsing through the room as Burke prepared to render his decision. At the defendant's table, Chris sat quietly, his hands resting on his neatly organized folders. Across the room, Jeffrey Lawrence shifted uneasily, the confidence he had carried into the courtroom completely shattered. Burke tapped his gavel lightly, signaling the room to come to order. He leaned forward, fixing Lawrence with a hard stare. Mr. Lawrence, he began, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. This court has reviewed the evidence presented by Mr. Peterson. Let me make one thing very clear. The conduct of your client, as evidenced by this case, is nothing short of predatory. Lawrence opened his mouth to protest, but Burke raised a hand, silencing him. No interruptions. This memorandum alone points to a deliberate strategy to target vulnerable homeowners, falsify records, and push foreclosures for profit. Such behavior is not just unethical. It's illegal. The gallery stirred, whispers erupting as Burke's words echoed through the room. Chris remained composed, though his heart raced with anticipation. He had come into this courtroom alone, armed only with his grandmother's trust and his determination to seek justice. And now, the moment of reckoning was at hand. Burke turned his attention to Chris, his tone softening slightly. Mr. Peterson, this court owes you an apology. I underestimated you when this trial began, but you have demonstrated remarkable resilience, preparation, and a commitment to truth that has turned this case on its head. Chris nodded respectfully, his voice steady. Thank you, Your Honor. My grandmother taught me to stand up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Burke tapped his gavel once more, his decision final. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Mr. Peterson. The foreclosure on his grandmother's home is hereby revoked. Furthermore, the bank is ordered to pay a substantial fine for its fraudulent practices and unethical behavior. The gallery erupted into applause, the sound filling the courtroom like a thunderstorm. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their cameras flashing as the news spread. Lawrence sat frozen, his face pale and his hands clenched tightly around the edge of the table. He had lost badly. Burke raised his gavel again, waiting for the applause to subside. Additionally, this court will forward the evidence of misconduct to federal authorities for further investigation. As the courtroom emptied, Chris Peterson remained seated, taking a moment to absorb everything that had just transpired. The echoes of the applause still seemed to hang in the air, resonating with the weight of victory. Against all odds, he had fought a powerful institution and won. Not just for himself, but for the memory of his grandmother and for every vulnerable homeowner who had been treated unfairly. The courtroom doors opened to the clamor of reporters and supporters outside, their voices a mixture of cheers and rapid-fire questions. Chris stood slowly, clutching the folder that held the evidence he had painstakingly gathered over the months. He straightened his shoulders, exhaling deeply as he walked toward the exit. Stepping outside, the bright Memphis sun greeted him, along with a sea of faces. Among the crowd, Chris spotted Helen Brooks, his grandmother's neighbor, who had bravely testified on his behalf. She approached him, her warm smile filled with pride. "You did it, Chris," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Margaret would be so proud of you." Chris smiled back, his eyes glistening. "She gave me the strength to do it. This wasn't just about the house. It was about standing up for what's right." The two of them stood in silence for a moment, taking in the energy of the crowd. Reporters pushed forward, microphones extended, asking how Chris, a man with no legal background, had managed to defeat a team of seasoned corporate attorneys. He answered humbly, emphasizing his grandmother's teachings about resilience and the belief that justice, though slow, was always worth pursuing. Later that day, Chris stood in front of his grandmother's house, a modest but beloved home nestled in a quiet Memphis neighborhood. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the lawn, and Chris found himself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. The house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of family, love, and the sacrifices his grandmother had made to create a stable life for her family. As he stepped onto the porch, he placed his hand on the doorknob, letting a surge of memories flood over him. Holidays spent around the dining table, his grandmother's laughter echoing through the halls, the warmth of a home filled with love. This victory was for her, for all she had endured, and for everyone who had ever been told they didn't stand a chance. Chris turned to face the street, his gaze steady as he addressed the cameras that had followed him there. "This case isn't just about me or my grandmother's house," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "It's about proving that no matter how powerful the opposition, the truth has its own strength. We have to stand up, even when the odds are against us. Justice is worth the fight." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers carrying into the evening air. Chris stood tall, feeling the weight of the struggle lifting, replaced by a newfound sense of purpose. This was more than a victory. It was a testament to the power of resilience and the belief that one person could make a difference. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Chris turned back to the house, stepping inside with a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had honored his grandmother's legacy, reclaimed what was rightfully hers, and proved that even against the most daunting odds, justice could prevail. I hope you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment, sharing your thoughts about it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new and equally exciting stories. See you in the next video.